Our first speaker is Ainie Grainger. Ainie is someone who has experienced growing up in a household with domestic violence, and she's going to be talking about her work trying to campaign to change the law in Ireland. So Ainie, if you'd like to start.
And listen to my story. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ainie Grainger. I'm 21 years of age and I'm from Dublin, Ireland. I suppose I can define myself as now a survivor of childhood domestic violence. And for me, domestic violence started for me when I was just 8 years of age. The first thing that I had thought of was domestic violence was my daily routine of school. So my daily routine of school would be basically get up, get dressed in the mornings. My mum, Priscilla, would be gone to work. And my dad at the time would usually drop me to school. So I go into primary school about, say, 8:39. So I go in there and I really enjoyed school. I enjoyed meeting my friends. I enjoyed chatting and talking. And I just really loved being a kid. And from then on, 3 o'clock every day, my dad would come and pick me up from school. And he'd say to me, how was your day? How'd you get on? And it wouldn't be, did you have a great day or whatever? It would just be general chit chat. So after that then, the routine was the same every day. It would be, okay, I just have to fly down to the shop. It would be the same set of shops we'd go to every day. And he'd get out of the car and he'd say, I'll be back in 2 or 3 minutes. And that 2 or 3 minutes turned into 3/4 of an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. As I went on, I was obviously wondering what had been going on. And it turned out that he had been going into the local bookies for up to 2.5 hours, gambling on horses. So gambling was the first part of the domestic violence. So each time he would go to the shop every day, he would come out and you would not know what humour he'd be in. You wouldn't know whether he'd be happy, whether he'd be sad. You'd know if he'd be angry because he would lose a bet and it would be taken out on his 8-year-old daughter. So anyway, we'd go home and after that then he'd say, okay, dinner's on the table. And more or less every day it was the same routine. He was very narcissistic, so same dinner, same routine every day. My dinner was 5 days a week, I'd say, was mince and carrots, and even to this day, I can't even stand the sight of it. So after that then, you kind of just go about my day. And obviously I thought this was normal growing up as a kid, so usually we used to have a little playroom and I go in and I play with my toys. Or sometimes I grew up as an only child, so I wanted to obviously have someone to play with. And on the likes of rainy days and stuff, I obviously wanted a parent to play with, and my mum was more or less the breadwinner in the family, so she was always at work. And my dad would usually be there and he'd be sitting on the couch. There wouldn't be much interaction. If I'd say to him, Dad, look, can I play with you, or will you play with me, or play with my dolls? I was a typical girl. I was a girly girl. I just wanted to play, and he wasn't having a bar of it. The earliest memory that I have of domestic violence was that same day. He left me in the car for about 2.5 hours. And I came home and I was begging with him and I said, Daddy, will you please play with me? Please play with my Barbie dolls. And he just wouldn't. And then I came down the stairs and the horse racing was on the telly. And next thing, I walked in front of the TV, and with that, he just grabbed me by the arm and he just punched me in the arm. And for that, he told me that I was being bold because I walked in front of his free time and his free entertainment. While he was meant to be helping me with my homework, looking after me, making sure that I was being a kid. At that time, I didn't know that that was domestic violence. So as I grew older, that same routine every day, I thought was normality. That was normality for me every single day. And it got worse and worse and worse. Being called names, being told that I'm not good enough, be told that I'd never achieve my dream in life, that what I wanted to do, that was never going to happen because I was just a piece of dirt on the ground. He didn't see me as his daughter. He didn't see me as a young child growing up and learning. I was meant to have a happy childhood. My mum gave me the best childhood she ever could when he left, but I never knew that this was domestic violence. So that was when I was about 8 till maybe about 9.5. And I had a very close relationship with my granddad. And unfortunately, he died in 2007. He was more so a father to me than anything else. I absolutely adored the ground that he walked on, and as did he. I just loved going up to my granny and granddad's house and seeing them, and he'd play with me, and he just has all the love in the world for me. And at that time, I didn't really understand. I just thought I was being bold with my dad. I didn't think anything of it. And when my granddad died, I was heartbroken because I felt like a little piece inside me had broken, and I felt my dad had actually died. I did never feel that my dad was ever there for me. So the violence continued on, and when I say the violence continued on, it wouldn't be 5 days a week, 7 days a week, like for harrowing hours. It would be this once off that you would never expect it. So as I grew older then, I suppose I started witnessing my mum and dad having domestics, and I suppose in that time I would hear it, and one of the memories that I have is I had been sitting in my mum's room, and my father, who was a taxi driver at the time, came home from work, and I just looked at my mum. Now, she obviously knew none of this was going on, so she had just heard, that he was just giving out to me, whatever. And I suppose as well, she was a little bit mind-warped and brainwashed because she obviously thought, this is, he's her father, and, this is what's going on. So after that then, we were sitting in my mum's room, and that was fine, and he came up, and I said, "Hiya, Daddy, how was your day?" And he just called me the C word, and straight away I just burst into tears. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to feel. And me and my mum had never had that conversation. We never had that thing of, like, Dad's hitting you. That was never a conversation in my house. So I looked at her. I said, "Mom," I said, "don't do it." I said, "You know what's going to happen." But there wasn't that thing of, you're going to be hurt tonight. It was just still that stigma attached. So he went downstairs, and he came back up after, and he said, "I'm sorry, Ainie, for calling you that." And I was really upset, and I didn't talk to him for days. So that was kind of one of the earliest memories I have. And then I suppose a lot of the time he would take his anger out on me when he didn't win a bet, as I was saying before. But one time I was doing piano lessons at the time, and my granddad was a great man for teaching me music and the piano, and he wanted me to have an absolutely amazing life. So he taught me the piano, and I went to piano lessons, even still after he died. And I came home one day, and my dad said, "Your dinner's on the table." And I said, "Look, Daddy," I said, "I'm not that hungry." I said, "Can I eat that later?" And with that then, I remember it was a Tuesday evening, about 5:30, and he got me by the arm, and he pulled me out the back. And I remember just standing out the back for what felt like hours on end. It could have been 5-10 minutes, and luckily my granny had come to the rescue, and she said, "What's Ainie doing out the back?" And he said, "Because she was bold and wouldn't eat her dinner." And I don't know at the time, though, did my granny ever think this was going on, but she knew something wasn't right with him. She knew he had a massive gambling problem. So they were kind of the earliest memories that I did have. And then as I grew older, I had my communion and then confirmation, and I suppose my mom then started to notice that her marriage just wasn't going to work out. And as I got older, the worse the violence got. It was screaming, it was shouting, it was just, even in my head thinking about it, it was a harrowing listening to it on a Friday or Saturday night when you should be sitting at home with your mom and your dad, watching a film, playing with your toys. That didn't happen for me. Me and my mom had the greatest times when he wasn't there, but the three of us, that didn't happen. And I remember, and I always say this, I had this little, it was like a wooden purple balloon, and it hung on my room, and it said my name on it. And I remember one night listening to the shouting and the screaming, and I just remember looking at that and just praying, when will this end? When will I have to still put up with this? So I didn't tell anyone. I went on about it as I usually would, went to school, daily routine again. And as I got older then, I was about 11 or 12, and suddenly it was all over. My mum had found out that he was having an affair with this other woman, and she said, "This is the only way I'm going to be able to get rid of him." And it's not easy to leave. It's never easy to leave. She left my very first New Year's Eve. It's never easy to just walk out that door. Your kids are your priority, but it's never, ever easy to leave. And that's what I always say to people, and even young people in relationships. And he was still living at the house at the time, but she kind of was playing it smart, and so was I. My relationship with him had completely deteriorated. He didn't want to know me, and I was kind of the same. I didn't want to know him. And after that then, he sat down one day and he said, Ainie, he said, can I talk to you? And I remember sitting on the computer, and I said, yeah, what do you want? And I suppose I was a very independent 11-year-old because I put up with so much crap from him that I was nearly rare myself as much as my mum was. So he said to me, I'm going to go and get psychiatric help. I'm going to go and get help for gambling, for my addiction, for my alcohol addiction, and I promise you I'll be a better daddy. And that's when I was 11 years old, and he never kept that promise. He went in for a week, and it turned out that the woman he was having an affair with was in there as well for her drug addiction. So he was never going to be a better parent to me. He was never going to be that father that I wanted there. And I suppose then as I grew older, it was more so having to deal with the fact that I didn't have a dad, and that was okay. All my other friends had a dad, but I didn't. But I didn't mind that because my mum is my mum and dad, and I'm so grateful for her. So after that then, I just remember my mum battling through the courts, and there was nothing for men, women or kids out there. And I thought growing up through life, is this the way my life is going to be? Are we going to be having to worry about money day in, day out? What are we going to do? My dad left my mum with absolutely nothing. She had her own business. He gambled it all. Any communion confirmation money, any money that my granddad left in his will, that was gone. He had this massive addiction, and this is where domestic violence stemmed from. So in and out of courts, and it's not easy in the courts. It's very difficult. I remember sitting in the family law court in Dolphin House when I was about 12 or 13, sitting outside, and I just remember, oh my God, like these people are obviously going through the same boat, but I was so oblivious to it all. I just didn't understand it. I didn't understand why my daddy was doing this, and why were other daddies so good and other mummies, and why was I here? I just didn't understand it. But at the same time, my mum was trying to keep me, she was trying to keep me protected and help me understand that, you know, you will be okay. So I was going for psychotherapy, I was going for counselling, anything that she could help me with, because she didn't want to see me just be another number on a list going into a hospital. She wanted to give me the best possible life that she could. So in and out of courts for years and years and years, and eventually we were doing B&B in Dublin, we were doing the bed and breakfast, and we slept on our kitchen floor some nights to give up for people in the B&B. We took in students, we cooked them dinners, anything that we could do to survive domestic violence, we had to do it because the law was not on our side. So after that then, we decided, when I was about 14, something has to be done with this law, because domestic violence, and believe it or not, it's not a crime in Ireland. And we decided to set up our own foundation. So our foundation is called Stop Domestic Violence in Ireland. I also have my own little campaign called Say No to CDV, and that's called Say No to Childhood Domestic Violence. And the reason we set this up is because in Ireland, I don't know about over here, but it seems to be kind of worldwide that domestic violence is this stigma. It's this brushed under the carpet thing that no one wants to talk about. And I think from a very early age, a lot of people go through it and they don't realise. Then they go on to relationships, and then they think, is this domestic violence? Is this what I have to go through? And obviously now with the foundation, we didn't realise how many more people were going through the same thing that we were, until people approached us and said, I understand what you have went through. I've went through the same thing, but I haven't got the first thing or the first clue. Like, what do I do? So myself and Mum decided, do you know what? We want to be able to help other people that have helped us. So we set up the foundation a couple of years ago, and it has just grown and grown. So what we do in the foundation is, we could get calls, as Eva will give you this example, 7 o'clock this morning we got a call from a victim in massive trouble. She had no idea what to do. And the reason she had no idea what to do is because the law is not on our side. We don't have that thing where you can walk into a court and they're supportive. There may be some people that are supportive, but not everybody is. So what we do is, if anyone comes out, we always say plan to exit. And the reason why we have that quote is you plan to exit. You don't just get up and leave, because the first step is leaving. The first step is your priority, is your kids. You have to want to leave. You have to want to get out. So we plan emergency bags, and the support that we get is absolutely incredible. We would get clothes, we get food, we put them into a safe house, and more times than ever, we've put them into our own house just to keep them safe. And this is the reason why so many men, women and kids are murdered in Ireland. Like, it's actually ridiculous, the amount of people who are after being murdered in the last couple of years. Even a girl recently, Nadine Lott, she was murdered in Ireland by her ex-partner, who she had tried to get away from. So it even goes to show you, even when you're away, you can still be murdered. So it's horrific what's going on, because my thing on it is, this is something we need to talk about. I'm 21. This is something that I talk about. This is a conversation I have with my friends, and I'm sure some people here are in the same boat, and they need to talk about it as well. And I know some people obviously would ask me and say, well, how do you feel, previous relationships or current relationships that you've been in have been? And I've been in 2 serious relationships, and the first one was mental and verbal. The second one was just lies, manipulation, and believed his own lies. So it was more so everyone thought that he was this, really nice guy on the outside, but really on the inside, when you're together, he's so manipulative. He tells you, we can't do this, we can't do that, and that's not something that I want. I can't be a hypocrite for myself and then tell other people, no, you're going through that. So right now, you have to do the best for you. And I would say to anyone here, or to anyone that you know or you think is going through the domestic violence, you can come and speak to me at any time. So how I put the foundation out there is through my Facebook, Snapchat and Instagram. And the reason why I don't have the likes of an Instagram or Snapchat page for the domestic violence is because if your abuser takes your phone and looks at your phone, he or she is going to say, okay, well, there's obviously, she feels that they're going through domestic violence. So I have my own page, and it's very private, it's anonymous. If anyone feels that they need to speak to me, anyone here today, that's no problem at all. But the one thing that I will say is that the huge problem in Ireland that we have is the people who are in these governments and who are in politics. Because we have a minister at the moment, there's a huge election, a general election going on, but he has refused to meet me 3 times. And I think the reason he's refused to meet me 3 times is because he knows that something needs to be done. But he's the one brushing under the carpet. He's the one adding the stigma to it. And if he's a Minister for Justice, I don't know what's going to come down the line. I'm scared for the young people in Ireland because I don't understand, or I don't know what's going to be next. And a huge issue that we have in Ireland, and especially Dublin, is cocaine. And I reckon that's where most of the domestic violence stems from. It stems from the violence, then it goes to mental health, then it's physical, and it's, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it, but that's not the way it should be. We should be able to have a conversation. If you're sitting in class, if you're sitting in the bar, have this conversation like it's a normal conversation. Like the likes of mental health, we should be able to have this. And once again, if there's anybody here today that is going through it, or knows anyone going through it, or a parent or a friend that are afraid to come out and say, I'm going through domestic violence, please, please, please do not be afraid, because I promise you it will get better and there is a light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thanks, Ainie. Next we have Elizabeth Woodcraft. She was the National Co-ordinator at the National Women's Aid Federation, and she advised on the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act of 1976. She's currently a full-time writer, and she's using her experience working as a barrister to inform her historical novels.
This is when it all started for me, in 1976. Well, in fact, it started a couple of years before that. It was in the early 70s, it was the beginning of the women's movement, and there was a lot of talk about what women's liberation meant, and I didn't think it meant anything to me. And then I was living in France at the time, and I read about Erin Pizzey and the refuge in Chiswick. And it seemed like that was something that was really useful that could be done, creating refuges for women who were suffering domestic violence. And when I came back to England, I moved to Leicester, and I heard that there was a women's aid group starting in Leicester, and I went along and I became a member of the group. And it was obvious to me at that time that domestic violence had been going on for a long time and that it was pretty much accepted in society. Sir Francis Buller, an 18th century judge, rumoured to have said, "A man may beat his wife with a stick as long as it's no wider than his thumb." The man was the king of the castle in his home, and he was allowed to control his wife. That was the 18th century. By the time I got there, it was clear that attitudes had changed very little, and it was very difficult for women to leave a violent situation. Lack of money, childcare responsibilities, and nowhere to go made it very difficult to leave. And the law was little help. Injunctions to control violent behaviour were difficult to obtain and were largely ineffective. The attitude of the police didn't assist. Domestic violence was seen as just as much the victim's fault as the perpetrator's. She nagged him, his dinner was cold, she answered back, and arrests were rare. When I was preparing this piece, I spoke to a police officer friend of mine who was working in the 80s, and he said allegations and injuries had to be extremely serious for any arrest to happen. No advice was given to women that would help them at all. There was no understanding of future risk, and most incidents were logged as all quiet on arrival and no cause for police action. So I got involved with Leicester Women's Aid. As I say, it was a voluntary organisation. No one was paid. I was a member of the support group. The local authority provided a house for us, and we raised money to paint it and put mattresses and beds in. And the refuge filled up almost as soon as we opened it. And all the women had the most terrible stories to tell, the sort of stories you've heard already this evening, sad, desperate stories, and they often had the bruises and worse to prove it. The support group assisted women with housing, social security and legal issues, as well as health and welfare problems, which they and their children encountered. As the months went by, we got another house, a second stage, which was on the other side of Leicester, which was the next stage for women who were moving on to help them prepare for a new life. Short personal note there, I was learning to drive in 1975. I just passed my test in a Mini. Women's Aid, our Women's Aid group had a large old ambulance, and that's what we used to move the women from the refuge to the second stage. And on the day after I passed my test, I had to drive through Leicester on a Saturday morning in the very old van. But fortunately, because it was so old and so battered, nobody came close to me, so I was able to drive everywhere that I wanted, even though I couldn't reverse, fortunately. Anyway, Leicester Women's Aid was part of the National Women's Aid Federation. You saw the banner there. All the groups in the country, apart from Chiswick, in fact, were members of the federation, and they were all organised in different ways. Some had money, some didn't. Some were set up by social workers, some were set up by interested people in the community, some were set up by feminists, or a mixture of all three. Some groups had paid workers, and some even had workers, play workers, to work with children. In 1975, the NWAF was looking for workers, and in December, I left my teaching job and took up the job of National Co-ordinator. Along with Jude Stoddart, we found premises in the basement of 51 Chalcott Road, Camden Town in London. Oh, look, and there we all are. Whoops. Now, this is not going to work, is it? There we are. We actually had our offices in the basement of that tiny weeny shop. Before that, it had been 2 boxes in Jude's front room. Almost as soon as I arrived in London, we got a phone call to say that Joe Richardson, the MP for Barking, had drawn in the lottery, she'd come out top in a ballot to enable her to put forward a private member's bill. And so it was that we spoke to her, and she wanted to do something about domestic violence. And we were advising her on the needs of women, what the women needed in and around, what the law could do to protect women, to assist women, to support women. And the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Bill lurched its way through Parliament. It has to be said that a lot of Tory MPs were very unhappy about it, and it got pushed back and pushed forward and back. But in the end, it became an act. I just put that there because that's just something worth remembering, that 2 women die at the hands of their former and current partners in England and Wales each week. So here we have the Domestic Violence and Matrimonial Proceedings Act, and one of the things that was so wonderful about it was that a power of arrest could be attached to an injunction. An injunction is a civil matter. You go to the county court, and an order is made telling someone that they can or can't do something. It's a civil matter, and it's really laborious. But with the new Domestic Violence Act, it was now possible to attach the power of arrest. This was a real breakthrough, to have the police having the power to act. I mean, they already had the power, let's face it. You know, if someone's been hit, someone else can be arrested. But strangely, they weren't using that power. So what the Domestic Violence Matrimonial Proceedings Bill and Act did was to underline how important it was that the police should do something. The other thing that was quite important, and is sort of relevant for now, for the discussions that are going on now, is that instead of the old assault and trespass proceedings, which is what women had to go through to get an injunction before, where their hearing was in open court, where anybody could come in and hear their business, their private, terrible events. Anyone could come in, and you could just get an injunction that really was not worth the paper it was written on. Lawyers had to be striding around in their wigs and gowns. But now, with the new Act, matters could be heard in private. And it sent out a message. I think that's the most important thing. It sent out a message. Domestic violence is wrong, and society and the law are taking it seriously, and it's got to stop. I mean, the other things that the Women's Aid Federation were doing were also important. We were dealing with government bodies, funding of refugees, payments to women, issues of social services and how the police responded. We were getting research, because research and statistics is so important when you're dealing with an issue like this. And the press came, we had to deal with the press. In 1976, it was a very big issue. And the Daily Mirror came and did a 2-page spread on us called Girls on a Mission. And it was all about the work of the Federation. Japanese film crews arrived, they wanted to know about it. But at the same time, we were organising national conferences. The Women's Aid groups from all over the country were coming together. And we were trying to work out a system whereby a woman could leave her local area and go to a refuge somewhere else for safety. All of these things we were having to do. It was new, it was exciting, it was terrible, it was really hard work. But we were doing it. And in fact, some of the things we were doing, well, first of all, we went to Brussels, a little bit poignant this week, where we went and gave evidence to the International Tribunal of Crimes Against Women. That's me on the bottom left-hand side. And then it was time for me to leave. And by this time, our staff had increased. We had 4 workers and an accountant. And I left to become a barrister. I didn't have a law degree. I did a conversion course. And I decided that what I wanted to do was carry on working for women, and so I became a barrister. At the time, Women's Aid was working very hard to bring the issue of domestic violence into public awareness. In the courts, things were slightly different. Judges really were very, very reluctant to deal with domestic violence as a thing. They really were. It took a long time to chip away at the attitudes. And one of my very first cases that I had to take to the Court of Appeal was a judge who, and this was in 1981, a judge who had, I think we all thought he was an old serviceman. The rumor was he'd commanded a submarine. I don't know if that was true. Anyway, but my client was not married, and throughout the hearing, the judge talked about my client's children as bastards, and he would just simply keep talking about bastards, which, you know, for a woman who's just gone through what she's gone through is very painful to hear. And also because my client had already had one injunction against this man and then gone back with him, as so often happens, and then now she was applying for another injunction. He simply said that he would not award her another injunction because he was not going to protect her and her bastards. So we went to the Court of Appeal. And Lord Justice Ormerod, who was a very kindly judge in the Court of Appeal, said that our judge must have been having an off day. Ha ha. And of course, if he'd thought about it, he would have decided differently. And so he asked the partner, the man, to give an undertaking. Of course, there is no power of arrest with an undertaking. So convincing judges that it was a problem took a long time, and also that it was harmful not just for the women, but also for the children who witnessed it. And it wasn't until the year 2000 that Elizabeth Butler-Schloss, who was at that time the president of the family division in the Court of Appeal, accepted that that domestic violence that children saw was harmful to the children. I mean, that's only 20 years ago. I mean, we had been fighting, we'd been arguing it in the courts all the time, saying, come on, this is not good enough. But it took that long for it to become an accepted case. Otherwise, you'd be arguing each individual case that it was important. But when you've got a case decided by the president of the family division, then you can accept it as a given. And the case was the famous case of Ray L., a child, contact domestic violence. And in that case, Drs. Sturge and Dr. Glazer said that domestic violence involves a very serious and significant failure in parenting. That sounds such a simple thing to say, but it was really important. But one thing I just wanted to say was, when did you last read a story about that? When did you last read that domestic violence was damaging? When did you last read? Whoa. Just give me a moment. This is hopeless. I wanted to get back to those statistics that 2 women die at the hands of their former and current partners in England and Wales each week. And the fact is, you don't read about it because it happens so often, it's not news. And I know one of the discussions that's going on at the moment is, can we open up family courts, because nobody knows what goes on. And there's a big move to say we must open up family courts. Well, let me tell you, Lord Justice Munby, who was the predecessor to the current president of the family division, tried that. And he said, certainly the press can come in. And they didn't, because they weren't interested. So we were all very anxious when he made this ruling that the press could come into cases. And we were all thinking, oh no, this is terrible. These women, they're going to be talking about these terrible things that have happened to them. And and we're going to have the press sitting at the back. It didn't happen. They weren't prepared to report it. So that's one of the things that, just to think about. Yes, of course, we need to know what's going on in our courts, but actually, who's telling us? The press, and they're not interested, because it's not a sexy story, unless, of course, the husband is killed by the wife, as in the Sally Challen case, and we all have heard about that. And of course, there are some wonderful things that have come out of that, and I think she would accept that coercive control is one of the definitions now of domestic violence. And just a word for any of you who are thinking of becoming academics or doing research. Research is what we need. When we were in court, really what we needed were statistics. We needed to be able to say, this is what's going on, this is what's the problem, this is how big it is, and this is why you've got to do something about it. And I'm now going to try and find some statistics that we already have, just to show you how important those statistics are. There we are. I think this is a statistic that Lindsay might be referring to in a bit. Whoa. Look at that. Look at that. 599,000 domestic abuse-related crimes recorded by the police in the year ending 31st of March 2018, and a further 598,000 not subsequently recorded as time. That's a lot of violence going on and not being brought to public attention. And then, look at that. The next comment, the economic and social cost. And this is a report done by the government, prepared for the government, which estimated that social and economic cost of domestic abuse in the year ending March 2017 was approximately £66 billion. Think about that. And yet, that's a breakdown. It's a bit small, so I won't stay very long on it. That's an actual breakdown of the figures from the Home Office report. But the local authorities' spending on refugees is going down and down from 31 million in 2010 to 23.9 million in 2017. So 60% of victims are unable to be housed because of lack of space, and then a concomitant fact to that is that the primary reason for women experiencing homelessness is cited as domestic abuse. So, how am I doing for time? Have I got 2 minutes? Yep. Okay, just really to finish off, I just wanted to say that in 2015, I don't even know where to direct it. Has anything? There we go, that's the one I want. There we are. The Special Rapporteur for the UN, or for the Council of Europe, reported about problems in social services and the effects of cuts in social services. And the problems that mothers who are victims of domestic violence are often re-victimized by the child protection system, because that's one of the risks, that it's now seen that domestic violence is bad for children, and if you're not careful, a social worker will think, well, then we better remove the child from that family, so then women don't want to report, because there's not enough support prepared or ready and available for women. So there is still a lot of work to be done. And I think, just to finish, the recent case that you may have read about of the judge who decided that a woman's description of herself as being raped could not have been raped because she didn't fight back, has now been roundly criticised in the Court of Appeal, or in the High Court. But what it shows is that there are still judges out there who haven't either listened to the training or had the training to tell them where we are now in the world, that this is the 21st century, and things have changed, and women have rights, and women have fears, and women are assaulted, and he's got to get real. And there are so many problems now because of austerity. So we need more training, we need more refugees, we need more support, social workers, we need more social workers need better training, hospitals need better training. There's a lot of work to be done, but I think we can say that things are slightly better than when I started in the middle of the 1970s. Thank you very much.
I don't know if I want that.
Thanks, Liz. Finally, we have Lindsay. Lindsay is the head of UK Says No More, a national campaign which aims to raise awareness of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Thank you. I'm going to move this forward a bit. I'm one of those people that talk like I'm flagging down aeroplanes, so bear with me. Okay, great. I'm Lindsay. I'm from UK Says No More, which is a national campaign around the prevention and awareness of domestic abuse and sexual violence. It is also part of an international campaign that spans most continents besides the Arctic. So we have No Mores in the US, South America, Africa, Australia, and Baroness Scotland has just announced that she's keen to see all 53 Commonwealth countries embrace the No More message and movement and our calls to action. So predominantly as a campaign, we do a lot of work around raising awareness, but in particular we've been focused on the domestic abuse bill. And in doing so, we have about 450 partners and about 160 MPs who have all signed up and supported our Charter on Prevention. And our Charter on Prevention has asked for 3 huge calls. And obviously when we get into the nuances of the domestic abuse bill, they have very stringent different lines in it. But overall, we're asking for 3 things. Firstly, that we want domestic abuse domestic abuse, healthy relationship education, and consent education to expand beyond the classroom and into the community. We know that in order to end domestic abuse and sexual violence, we all have to feel that we are responsible and therefore able to respond. The second point is acknowledging that children are not only victims of domestic abuse, but they have their own experiences too. So for us, changing the language in the domestic abuse bill, in the statutory guidance, and the way in which we talk about children who are living in homes who are witnessing domestic abuse will make a massive difference in the way that they can then access support, services, and access to education. Oh my gosh, it goes according to itself. And the third point is looking to employers. Because what we know is that actually all employers have a role and an opportunity to respond effectively to domestic abuse. And sometimes that can be really practical things about having annual leave, but in other instances it's just asking those questions and providing access to that support. So as a campaign, I'm going to here to talk to you about something perhaps a little bit different. And that is that every single one of you who are either watching this or sitting in this room today have an opportunity to respond. What we know is that victims of domestic abuse tell us one really important factor, is that in their early instances when they started to understand what they were experiencing, that they did turn to their friends, family members and colleagues and did ask for help. But often that ask for help was quite clouded in trying to understand what was going on, and often that was missed. We know that many victims will endure 33 incidences of domestic abuse and possibly speak to 13 different people, professionals included, before they access the support that they need. And our aim, and everyone's aim, I'm assuming, is to ensure that we reduce the amount of time someone endures domestic abuse, has access to those services so that they can leave and move into a safe space. So, in order to do that, I think one of the first and most important things is to understand that domestic abuse is a process. And that if there's anything that I can leave with you today is that if you are going to be somebody that somebody will turn to, you need to know that nobody falls in love with an aggressive, abusive, controlling and manipulative partner. Who you fall in love with is the life and the soul of the party, somebody who wants to get to know you, someone that wants to know everything about you, somebody that wants to help you. And we all know that domestic abuse is a process, that is many instances that in the isolation can sometimes be looked at as, oh, it's quite a normal response to say to your partner, let me make sure that I control the finances because you're not so good with money. But when you start to add all these incidences up, they really paint that picture of a controlling and coercive relationship. We also know that domestic abuse is about power and control, and that actually if you, at the moment of that power and control being lost by that perpetrator, that person's, the victim's risk significantly increases. So it's never going to work, that statement where you say, well, I'll go and have a word with them because I'm sure I'll be able to sort things out. The victim knows that perpetrator in and out, and they know that it won't stop. they also know that it will probably make things significantly worse, so we would advise against it. So going back to that cycle of abuse, if you are that person who's offering that support, albeit a friend or you're listening to somebody talk, it's really important to know how that cycle works, knowing that actually an abusive partner, their number one priority is to isolate and to make your self-esteem disappear. And lots of those things start off with quite legitimate sentences, which we would say to each other, or even ourselves have said to our partners, but it's when you start to add them up. So if you can imagine a circle, and you can imagine that in that first instance, you meet this person, they're the life and the soul of the party, everybody wants to know them, you divulge so much of your information to them. That's great. And then you start to recognize that actually you have some debts in yourself. And your new partner says to you, you know what will really work really well? I care so much for you. If you put your entire salary into my bank account, I will pay off your debts and I'll give you just a little bit of money so that you can start to regain and, manage your money appropriately. That's the first stage. The next stage will be, oh, well, last time you went to see your sister, you came back really upset and really hurt. Is it really worth seeing your sister? Or don't go for that promotion at work. They just take advantage of you. And actually, it's not really worth you working anyway. So where you can see that this abusive partner is slowly and surely taking away that person's opportunities for financial independence, for social independence. And obviously this expands even greater if you're thinking about, you've got children and you're thinking about then how you're isolating your ability to be a parent. It's important to understand that cycle of abuse. It's important because we know that if someone is enduring domestic abuse, that often they do return to their abusive partner. And that's not for any other reason besides that it's incredibly difficult to leave. So, and especially more so now than ever potentially before. Every single time we hear a great tech company, and I know you're really close to many of those tech companies here in Cambridge, release this fantastic new product that will change everybody's lives. It also changes the ability for an abusive partner to monitor, surveil, and keep tabs on that victim. And so what we know now is that the ability to flee, that you spoke so eloquently of about moving to another part of the country, for example, to women's refuge, is becoming increasingly more difficult because the amount of monitoring and surveillance opportunities abusive partners have. What we also know is that at the point of separation, a victim is at the most significant harm, and that domestic abuse doesn't end when that relationship ends. So if you are working with somebody, if you are talking to your friend or a colleague, and you're saying to you, how should I respond effectively? What role can I play that's important and safe? The key thing is to listen. And I cannot stress how important that moment is. How many survivors have said to us in our services and our refuges or our IDFA services, I told my friend, and the thing that she said to me was, no, I can't believe it, he's so lovely, or she's so great. I told my mom, and my mom said, oh, but he's great with the kids. I told my dad, and he said, but she's so good with the job that she does. It's those instinctive responses that we offer up without thinking sometimes, in most instances without even thought, that can compound and make it, unfortunately, sometimes more difficult for a victim to flee. The role that we can do is talk about healthy relationships and consent. If somebody comes to you to say, actually, my partner's checking my Facebook, and I don't really like it, your role in that moment is to say, well, that's not really healthy, and that's not what many other relationships do. That tiny nugget of information is a seed that's planted that becomes that message that person knows that they know that they know. And slowly and surely encourage that power to happen. The other thing, and perhaps one of the most important things to hold on to, is that at the point of separation, someone is at the most significant risk. We have numerous studies that show that actually those are the people who are enduring coercive and controlling behavior may not have come to the attention of the police. In the previous slide, there was a notion of how many non-crime domestics are called upon. So what they look like is that a neighbor, for example, has called the police arrive at a property. In that moment, there's no noise happening anymore. They do not arrest an abusive partner. They leave, they log it as a non-crime domestic. But what we know is that those enduring coercive and controlling behavior are significantly higher risk of experiencing homicide. And in order to prevent that, we need to ensure that we are acknowledging what that coercive and controlling behavior looks like, naming it, and ensuring that person has access to that specialist support service. So, what do those specialist support services look like now? We have a huge network of services, and although that you will hear consistently from anybody who's working in the sector that we don't have enough services, we do have some excellent ones that still exist. Since 2007, we've had between a 40 and 60% reduction in the amount of funding that we've received in our services, at the same time where referrals have quadrupled in some instances. We know that as caseworkers, we're dealing with more difficult cases, more intricate cases with webs of control and surveillance happening, and actually unpicking all of that and ensuring that someone moves to that place of safety becomes increasingly more difficult. We know that we need a domestic abuse bill that works for those that are enduring domestic abuse, for the children whom will grow up to be adults, but also for those who are working around the sector. The other thing to remember is that of the services that exist, we have independent domestic violence advocates. So across the UK, you should be able to contact your specialist service and their crisis intervention. They are the specialists. If that friend or family member or colleague says to you, something's not right in my relationship, something doesn't feel okay, the best thing that you can do is make that referral. Pass on that telephone and say, hey, you have chat lines that work now with Women's Aid, you have direct phone numbers that you can go through to the refuge helpline, or in many instances, many of the charities and organisations that work in the sector have lots of supportive tools that can be available so that you don't have to potentially go to somebody straight away. You can talk over a technological tool. The other thing is that IDFOs will work with the police, the criminal justice system, to try and create that safe place. That will be using some civil orders as well as criminal justice orders, but ultimately is to ensure that family is safer. From that point, they may be referred onto a floating support service, if those still exist. What we have seen a huge drop in is those services, and those services were set up 20 years ago to reduce isolation and repeat victimization. So that was looking at things like ensuring long-term stable accommodation, integration into work, into education, but also linking in with that greater family and that community. Isolation is absolutely horrendous. And if you're a victim of domestic abuse who's had to move across the country and is now bringing up children who are enduring and experiencing the trauma from what they've witnessed and what they've experienced, to do that alone is very, very difficult. And so being linked in with those services, being able to create peer relationships with friends or other people who've endured domestic abuse is absolutely vital. MARIC is a multi-agency risk assessment conference set up following the community coordinated response, which if you have time and you are interested in the history of how supports worked around domestic abuse, it's worth looking at the Duluth model and some of the learning that has come from that, especially about the work that they currently do with perpetrators of domestic abuse. MARIC's run across the UK in lots and lots of different local authorities as well as your own, and what they do is they bring together professionals who sit around a table from the police all the way through to social services and create a plan to ensure that that family is kept as safe as possible. Interestingly, most of the support that's put in place is to the perpetrator in some instances, and this is because we know if we can move that perpetrator into drug and alcohol support, into their own accommodation, we can then focus on how do we enable the family that still exists to move to that place of safety and what we can do. We have peer support groups and we do have refuges. What we know about refuges in the UK at the moment is that they only work for some people, that we actually do have a whole group of women, men, and people who identify as non-binary or who are transgender who cannot access refuge space. Most people access it by using housing benefit, or if they are working, by paying for their rent. But if you do not have the means to pay for your refuge accommodation, for example, if you're here in the UK on a highly skilled migrant visa, if you're here because you're on a student visa, or you're attached to your partner's visa, your ability to be economically independent is significantly reduced, which creates what we often call a hidden group of people who have no access to public funds. If you're here in the UK and you're on a spousal visa, you have what's called access to a destitute domestic violence concession, which will give you access to refuge. But that still leaves those people who are on those visas or who are from the European Union who wouldn't pass habitual residency test. What happens with that group of people becomes more and more terrifying. We know that we can work with them through our IDFA services, but actually often to ensure someone's safety, it could include moving to a new place, having new rent. How does that look like? How can we ensure someone does that safely? The other things that we do have are specialist services. So, if, for example, if you have complex needs, we know there's we understand and appreciate the intrinsic link between mental health and domestic abuse, bearing in mind that those who've endured domestic abuse have experienced prolonged experiences of trauma, intimate partner terrorism. In many instances, victims will talk about living their life in a state of walking on eggshells. And nobody can endure that level of trauma without having some level of mental health afterwards. That could range from agoraphobia, night terrors, to potentially having panic attacks or feeling unable to function in a day-to-day living. And that all comes down from those experiences of trauma. Having therapeutic support for both children and adults in refuges and services is absolutely imperative. The police can do some great work. We have got some great links, and we have some positive responses from when police do things well. We know that the police themselves are under pressure with the number of call-outs that they get and how they respond. But I can assure you in saying that there is a huge process about linking services who work with victims and the police together so that we can share those experiences and learn from each other. The other thing to consider is that we do have perpetrator programs in the UK. You may have heard of the organisation called Respect, or you may have heard of DVIP. They are few and far between, and some perpetrators do benefit from them, but not all. And ultimately, what we hear from those that have endured domestic abuses, they're not interested in finding that out. They want to move to that place of safety, they want to move on with their lives, and they want to regain their own sense of self and their own independence. So ultimately, what we're saying is that in order to respond to a victim of domestic abuse, there are 3 things that you can really do incredibly well. The first one is believe them with unconditional positive regard. Listening is the most powerful tool. It is something that most victims of domestic abuse will say that was the best thing that happened to them, in that they found a friend, a family member, a colleague, or sometimes even a professional who took the time out to listen. And the next thing is respond. And the best response to do is a human response. A glass of water, a quiet moment. What practically do you need to get yourself to that place of safety? And then the most important thing I would always say is refer to that specialist support service. As specialist support services, we're set up in such a way we have 45 years, 50 years of experience, of learnt experience from those who've worked in the services before, from different pilots that have happened, from different research, but most importantly from those that have experienced domestic abuse and they've told us what they need. And in doing that, we're able to respond really, really well. Don't hold that on yourself. Refer to that service and they'll work in tandem with you. And then finally, because I want to leave you with a bit of a gift, sort of, not really, that wasn't the gift. How do I go back? Good question. And this is available in Ireland as well, and it's just been launched with, I think Irish Women's Aid, but it's the Bright Sky app. It's available here in the UK, free to download on Android and Google, and it provides you with a comprehensive GPS location of all the independent domestic violence advocacy services in the UK, as well as having 2 self-assessment questionnaires that will enable you to identify the abuse that you're experiencing, if it's about your own relationship, or if you're concerned about a friend or family member. It's a great tool to go through together, and it has lots of different suggestions about the types of things you can do or think about doing to keep safe and also the person safe, and most importantly what it's like at that point of separation. And then due to the introduction of the coercive control law in around about December 2015, we've also included a diary entry system which enables those that are enduring or experiencing domestic abuse a safe way to keep a log of what is happening. What we know from the police in this instance in the moment is that the way in which they're looking to prove or to account for people who have experienced domestic abuse in the criminal justice system is by looking at that process. What was that experience like? What were the number of incidences? What did those individual incidences look like? But actually, more importantly, what did they look like together? And to be able to keep that log of information can be quite dangerous. So what we're saying with the app is that if you set up a brand new email address, if you have support to do that from a specialist service or a friend, family member or colleague, this can be a way for you to keep this information. We know of 2 prosecutions which have been successful, and the evidence gained from Bright Sky was part of that success, but obviously only part of the greater picture of it, so it is a tool that can be used. And ultimately it's there. There are many other digital tools which are available, as well as having the National Refuge Helpline. But most importantly, in every local area, you have an independent domestic violence advocacy service who will be more than welcome, more than willing to have a conversation with you if you're concerned about someone or concerned about yourself. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. I know we're a bit pushed for time, but does anyone have any questions they'd like to ask just before we go? Yeah, can I take it over there? Can I have a microphone?
Could you use the microphone? Because no, thank you, I can't.
Men as the victim of domestic abuse, whether that kind of comes into play when you're doing cases on it, and whether there's kind of like a gender discrepancy within that.
There are those cases. I think it is accepted that there aren't services that work with men. I mean, you might be able to answer this. I do know that in the early days, Erin Pitsey did set up a refuge for men. They didn't want to come. I think it is difficult for men to accept what's happening to them, possibly even more difficult than it is for women. And so I think sometimes it's quite difficult to give support to men. Is that your experience?
I mean, what we know now, for example, right now, we've been working with the Home Office on a campaign for male victims of domestic abuse. And what we know that men do present. We have very close links with Gallup and a charity called Mankind Initiative. Gallup working with men in same-sex relationship, and Mankind working with men who are in heterosexual relationships. And we know that statistically, men do experience it. They experience it slightly, potentially differently than the way women would experience domestic abuse, but they do experience coercive and controlling behavior. They do speak about the fact that they struggle to come forward, and actually who they go to first of all is often the police. And when they finally do speak to somebody, the response can be quite varied from place to place. There's quite a good documentary that Alex Skeel did. I think it's on BBC, that talks about his experiences. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper into hearing about how we talk to men and what we talk to men about, often they prefer to talk sort of over a helpline opposed to face-to-face. There are some men who are looking for men's refuge spaces. We know of a few. But there aren't any in London, for example. And those coming to those refuge spaces often do come with their children. And it's how we then work around that in that way. I think the work that we're doing with men is really quite interesting in that we know relationships are changing quite rapidly, and the way in which we start relationships and the way that we share information is different. So I think in the next 5 to 10 years, working with men will be slightly different than it is right now. But yeah.
Yeah, are there any other questions? Yeah, can I have a microphone over here, please?
Okay, so this is perhaps more a question for you, Lindsay, but you've talked about the different steps through which men can become more abusive and take control. Do you think those steps are always taken consciously, or do some men have those ambitions unconsciously? So, yeah, in cases of abuse.
I mean, I'm going to caveat this with a really, really big statement, that we've spent hours and months and years doing so much incredible and useful research on the experiences of those that endure domestic abuse, but we spend very little time talking to those that perpetrate abuse. And when we do hear from those that perpetrate abuse, it can be so varying and so different that there's no direct sort of linkage that you can go backwards. But what we can see is that there is something around having power and control over a partner. One thing that we do know is that if you experience domestic abuse as a child, you're more likely to experience it as an adult opposed to perpetrating it. And often that's one of the biggest myths that is sort of said out there, but actually if you endure it as a child, more likely to endure it as an adult. We know that when men are challenged within their peer groups, it can be quite supportive in the sense where, minds will change. Interestingly, we did a piece of research over the summer which told us that no amount of positive male role models make a difference if you don't hold a man to account when he perpetrates abuse. So that was quite an interesting piece of learning. I would say that it's quite interesting to look at some of the homicide reviews, and Standing Together did a great research project on 100 of them trying to understand the perpetrators of abuse.
Can I just ask you to explain that thing? Having good male role models doesn't work if you don't stand up to someone who perpetrates what?
It was incredible.
How does that work? I mean, what does it mean?
So what we always say from a campaign point of view is actually in order to prevent domestic abuse, what we need are a lot of really good positive male role models.
Yes.
You know, saying no to domestic abuse, publicly saying it, talking about healthy relationships and consent, and they are vital. They're incredibly important. But the moment somebody does perpetrate abuse and they are not held to account, it sort of wipes all of that good work away. And that's really important when you think about some of the people right now who are going through court systems. You know, we have Harvey Weinstein, and we have, you know, everything that's happened with LeVon Bryant and everything like that. If we don't hold those that abuse to account and we wash over that abusive behavior and, you know, lionize them into something that differently, then actually that does more damage than all of the good work that those positive male models
So do you
make.
mean that it creates an environment where people think, oh, well, he got away with it, and so...
Absolutely.
Oh, you know, they're a bit flimmy-flammy, those people being so nice. Let's be macho. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and it's a case of, I mean, it was a study that was quite interesting that had lots of other information, but I think that jumped out for us. And we were specifically asking, who are those role models in your life? Are they sports people? Are they community leaders? Are they your intimate family or your parents, your uncles?
So who are you asking, children or adults?
We asked adults in that instance. We asked men, and they said to us, the men said to us, great work from positive role models, but the moment you don't hold someone to account, we think, what's the point? And that was a scary, shocking thing from that research. You know, so we're delving more into it, but yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, do you have any final questions, or? Yeah, just over there.
So does this mean like that the question is not actually like is it like actually that they don't understand what they're doing, or is it like actually that they don't care the abusers? Like, because like if they're like, do they not understand that their behavior is abusive?
The reality,
the easy ones are the best. Yeah.
I mean, the reality is that so few perpetrators have actually told people what it is. So if me sitting here, and I'm sure you'd say the same, it's speculating. Victims tell us that their perpetrators know exactly what they're doing. And this is a tool that they use, it's calculating, it's thought through, it's purposeful, but then you could meet somebody else that would say, actually, that's a different perspective. And what we know is that perpetrators can change their behavior. Some perpetrators can. How long they change that behavior for can quite vary. There's no real research out there that says that it's ultimately really successful to go through a perpetrator program and that all perpetrators would achieve at the end of it. So really, there isn't enough to say about it in some ways, no research to underpin it. I don't know if you have any...
Well, I was just thinking, I mean, you know, you do have cases that go back to court time and again, and women have to bring the men back to court. And the men still do it. And if you might have had a really good judge who's really spoken to the man really clearly and said, look, this is unacceptable. I don't accept it. Society doesn't accept it. You know, just pull yourself together. And still it occurs. And so, you know, you have to think somewhere they don't care, but maybe they can't help it either. But, you know, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Have you got anything to say about that? What do you think?
I don't know. I just think with men it's very difficult because there's still obviously this stigma attached as it is for women and for kids. But I think if we had, obviously over here, but especially in Ireland, because it relates to me more, that if we had this proper law for not just women and men, but for obviously kids as well, but for the men, we have Amen over in Dublin, and it's absolutely brilliant. Like, the work that they do is amazing, but it's so difficult for men to come forward because there's this thing in Ireland where, okay, so your wife or your partner hit you couldn't hit her back. That's that thing that's attached. And I mean, if we had a proper law and even ministers and politicians are coming forward, their men, why don't they come forward and say, it's okay to be a man, it's okay to be hit if you're a man, we can help you, do you know what I mean? It's just a stigma attached, and I think Ireland is hopefully not always going to be like that, but it has been like that the last maybe 15, 20 years. So yeah, I think hoping obviously for change. But
You've got a lot of work ahead of you.
Yeah, a lot of work, because I mean, you have this new government that are being elected into Ireland, and I think it's very difficult. They don't want to listen to people, and obviously for women and for kids, it's very difficult. But I think the first thing with men is belief. There's not an awful lot of belief in Ireland either for men, and it's hard for them to come forward because they're embarrassed, obviously, to be hit by, say, if they're a man or a woman that's hitting them, do you know?
But what do you think about the whole thing of if a man is told, you know, you shouldn't do that, and yet he still does it? What do you think?
I just, like, we go to the courts time and time again, and we sit in, obviously not the family law cases, but you hear of women and men going in and they're told, you know, it's just a slap on the wrist. And more times, 9 out of 10, it's more times, you know, you don't do that again. You're entitled to see your child once a week. And I just think the judges, the guards, the police need more training to understand that this is not just a slap on the wrist, because the first time it could be a slap on the wrist, the second time their partner could be murdered.
I think the other part of it is, I suppose we all have to ask ourselves, when did we last sit down and think about what a healthy relationship looked like?
Yeah.
And what are the behaviors within a healthy relationship?
Yeah.
And actually how we can, without, you know, we can overstep and things like that. And without that really good, healthy relationship education, things can go awry. And, you know, when I've spoken to some men, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, where I did a piece of work with the NFL where we trained a group of young men to become sort of ambassadors for change, and they redelivered training around healthy relationships and consent. And I think the number one thing that was really quite interesting is that we'd assign some time to talk about healthy relationships, thinking that we would get through it quite, you know, within half a day. But ultimately, the young men said to us, stop. We really want to explore this more because we are constantly getting it wrong, and actually can we test some things out with you? And that was a very interesting moment, sometimes very quite scary in the things that we responded to, but actually we have to ask ourselves as a society, how many times are we talking to our, you know, our children, our young people about what it really looks like to have a healthy relationship? How do we disagree with each other in a really healthy way? How can we respect each other in those moments where we disagree so that both people still feel safe? And actually, what does unsafe look like, and how do we do that to somebody else, maybe with no intention, but actually do it? We can all look at ourselves and be a bit better.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just conscious of the fact that it's now 6:20, but I'd just like to thank our speakers for coming today and speaking. So, thank you.